So developing for mobile. Strategies for success, picking a platform, and emulation are the 3 topics. So strategies for success. This list are the things you need to remember, I think. Constrained resources, knowing your audience, less is more, always be prepared, and use strong design. So I'm going to talk about sort of what I mean by each of these, because this is the sort of mental shift you need to have of assumptions that you might have made in other development that aren't valid. So, constrained resources. This thing, and this is becoming less true. Less memory, less horsepower, certainly less bandwidth, right? That means that certain assumptions you made aren't valid anymore. Assumptions about like the fact that you can just allocate memory as you see fit. You can make as many variables as you want. No, you can't. Welcome back to the world of computer science and programming. This is back the way we used to have to worry about all these things, right? So back when I was learning computer science, we had to worry about things like memory allocation and making sure we had enough memory to be able to do things. We've come to a point now where we have so much horsepower on desktops and even on websites that you generally don't need to worry about that stuff. For like a lot of applications and websites, you don't need to optimize until you start getting real traffic. And you don't need to worry about like making sure there's space in your memory before you start using it. When you move to here, you're taking a big step back in time. You have a lot of resources and power, but compared to what used to be, but you still have some of the same constraints. So remember that a lot of things sort of have handcuffs on them, okay? This one's gonna have a lot more zooming, so sorry if you get dizzy on this. Know your audience. You gotta think about whether they have internet access, what speed it is, make smart decisions based on your user population, Android or iOS, and their context, right? So these are the things you need to keep in mind. And when you're designing a research study, if you know that your population is all iOS, then you have no choice. You have to go iOS, right? You just want to find a quick path to doing that. So that's the second topic. Third, less is more. We're reaching a point now where sort of the behemoth mobile app doesn't really exist anymore. So we see things like Facebook breaking their services into multiple different apps, right? The idea that they have their chat app, they have their photo sharing app, and then they still have their like feed app, which I guess Paper is the newest one, but they're splitting their sort of the things that the task-oriented things you want to do, right? I want to chat with people, I want to share pictures with people, and I want to check in on my friends, right? Those are 3 different tasks, to use Dominicus's language. They're splitting those into different apps. So we're ending up in a world where any mobile development you do is becoming more highly focused on the one task that you want to do. And so we see a lot of big companies splitting across it, right? Splitting across. And you see even so something like Yelp is one where you have a lot of tasks in one thing, right? You have checking in, you have writing reviews, which is kind of tied to checking in, or the same task, I would say. You have getting and finding places to go eat, right? Those are 2 major different tasks, right? So discovery and sharing are 2 very different tasks. I wouldn't be surprised if they end up splitting those into 2 different apps, just because that's where a lot of large companies are heading. They haven't yet, and maybe they don't need to, but it turns out that we're finding that the cognitive load of sort of putting all that into one app is something that people aren't responding well to. So focus. Always be prepared. So this is the third one. So I need 2 volunteers for this, comic version of the difference, right? This is the shit that happens when you're on mobile. Your app needs to know when a notification comes, you get an event. You remember the event-based programming? When you're writing a mobile app, when that notification comes, you'll get an event saying, hey, your app is going into the background, so you need to stop what you're doing, right? And then you'll get another event when that person's done dealing with it that, hey, your app is back in the foreground, so now you can start doing what you're doing again. And you don't get to do anything in the background by default, right? So you just got to pause. When you come back in, you got to remember what you were doing, and you got to pick up right in the middle of doing it again in a way that makes sense to the user, right? This is what I mean about dealing with the constraints and being prepared for things that might happen, right? So the last piece to talk about is this strong design. And this is where I really like these 2 diagrams that Dominicus uses. The one he uses, well, this one not so much. This one more, well, yeah, metaphor. Imagine the metaphors over here. So he has context, ergonomics, and conventions. So context is what the person is doing, thinking, and likely to be doing. Are they interacting with other folks, right? That context you need to think about all the time, right? If you're building an app that fires notifications at people, like they should just call them interruptions, not notifications, right? Like you are literally interrupting them and alerting them to something happening. And you need to be aware of what context they might be in when that's happening, right? They may not give two craps about your notification, so they might just dismiss it, and you need to be okay with that. Ergonomics was the thing about like what the affordances of, I think he talked about it as what the affordances of sort of the device and what people were doing are. Like where your finger's going to be, the touch size, and luckily both Android and iOS have really good design guides that sort of help you do this by default. Like make sure your button's big enough and make sure it's not in the wrong, they've made it harder to do the wrong thing when it comes to ergonomics. Since he did that talk, which was I think 2 years ago, they've made it harder to do ergonomics wrong. Conventions is the stuff where you need to know the physical language of interaction on the device, right? He talked about how, like pinch to zoom, how do we know what that means, right? The only reason we know what that means was because Apple, when they introduced the iPhone, ran ads that were tutorials, even though you didn't think they were tutorials, right? They sort of ran ads that taught you that this meant pinch, that this meant zoom. Right? This doesn't mean zoom naturally. So there's a certain set of conventions, and those are evolving, which is what sucks, right? Like pull down to refresh, that didn't exist when this stuff started. Swipe off to delete, people still argue about that, right? So these are these evolving set of conventions that you need to sort of be aware of and obey. You can't write mobile apps without having a mobile device that you're using every day. You're going to write crappy ones because you won't understand the conventions. Now, sure, if you're doing something novel and artistic and you want to break conventions on purpose, totally cool. But you better do that on purpose, not like, oops, I broke a convention. And he gives those as the examples. There's a bunch of other ones that if you take a step back from the apps you're using already, you'll sort of start to see what they are, right? We're switching from tab navigation on the bottom to this little like hamburger drawer that slides in on the left, right? That's a convention that's shifting. And you don't get to control these. You just need to play by their rules. So that's what he talked about with conventions. Then he talked about sort of user design stuff. Task is understanding what the user's, like how I talked about earlier, like what the user's focus is going to be. Like what are they trying to get done, and how are you helping them do that? Discoverability, this idea that the interface explains what it's doing or what it will do. This is sort of the classic thing where the computer scientists will say, oh yeah, well, just click on things till it works. And the user will say, like, I'm not going to click on things. That'll like set my house on fire or something, right? That's not going to change, and it hasn't changed, right? People are hesitant to click on things because they think clicking on the wrong thing will break. And like that's our fault. Right? The computer scientists taught them that because we made crappy software, and still do, that does break stuff when you click on the wrong thing. There is a new emphasis on trying to make that not happen. Discoverability is about the idea that the interface suggests to you what to do. Right? His example is buttons. A button should look like a button. Right? Whatever the convention on the platform is, a button should look like a button. Orientation, making sure that the user is aware of where they are within their task. Right? The idea that, oh, I did this, and now I've moved to here, right? However it cues them that something has changed, it needs to be like something that makes sense to users. That, oh, I've shifted in my task from phase 1 to phase 2. That's an important time to orient them that they've shifted, whether it's animation, whether it's physical movement, whatever that is. And fun is the most important. I totally agree with him, right? This stuff needs to be playful, and that's usually left out of most apps, right? Fun and playfulness is a wonderful invitation for people to use your software, right? And it's one, just like writing satire is sort of the hardest writing to be doing, creating fun invitations within your software is one of the hardest things to do well. You just sort of need to try it and see how 3 or 4 people react to it. So making it playful either in colors, interaction, or, like the classic example is the I'm feeling lucky button on Google, right? Which is like just says something about the fact that it's sort of, that's an element of UI added for fun, right? His example in the talk is the Facebook heads that you can move around. So how you make decisions about all that is your grounding metaphor, right? And that I can't emphasize enough, right? The grounding metaphor you use in your, and this is all, I'm not talking a huge amount about sort of user-centered design and collaborative design and the software design process, because we only have a limited amount of classes, but it's one that you could do a whole semester on. This is one place where I think it's super important, because if you get it wrong, it really hurts adoption of what you're trying to do, right? If you're trying to run a research project and you want 20 people to run your mobile app and do a study, if you don't get this stuff right, it's going to get in the way of you finding your results, right? People will complain when these things aren't right. And you'll be like, but what about this research question I have? What about my hypothesis? How do I test it? It gets in your way. So you have to get it right. Websites are far more forgiving on this stuff. I don't know why, but that's what I see. So you got to get your grounding metaphor right, because as he draws here, it underlines all of this stuff. So the grounding metaphor in your mobile app design needs to be really strong. It can be super simple, right? And this is where you sort of need to do your creative thinking, right? If you're making something like Yelp, right? And your metaphor is about being a strong community member, that's a very different grounding metaphor than like the metaphor of a person exploring the city, right? Those are two very different metaphors that are both embodied in Yelp, the app, but would lead to two very different products, right? One would make design decisions that are about contributing back to help other people. Another would make design decisions that are about trying to show you what's going on around you and making it easy for you to discover things, right? Two totally different design metaphors and different designs with the same set of technical functionalities. That's what I mean when I talk about how important metaphor is, okay? I think that's all I wanted to do for strategies for success. We used to call this stuff embedded development. So embedded is the older term we use for when silicon chips were in devices that were moving around, and the idea was that it was embedded in some real world context. Now we talk about this stuff as mobile, but all these things, if you used to do embedded development or heard about it, a lot of these first couple were true, right? Embedded development, you're like resource constrained, you couldn't count on connectivity. All these lessons are stuff that like older white men with beards that used to work on like radio firmware are really good at. And now suddenly, it's like when we did the shift, like when we went from landlines to cell phones, right? Like landlines were awesome. Dropped call? Never. Sound quality? Pretty damn good. We switched to cell phones, and now suddenly like people's calls drop all the time, the sound quality goes in and out. It's crazy, right? It's like really bad quality. This is the same thing that's happened with computers, from sort of desktop super resources to mobile. We've gone back to the world of dropped calls, as it were, in that metaphor. So you need to be prepared for that worldview, okay? Questions about this sort of high-level overview? No? Okay.